This play begins in November 1963 with the assassination of President Kennedy and the ascension to the White House by then Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it ends 12 months later with his landslide victory over Republican nominee Barry Goldwater. And in those 12 months, everything changes. I look at it as a hinge point in American politics. It is the beginning of the end of the Southern Democratic base. It is the beginning of the ascension of the conservative base in the Republican Party. It is the end of the old black and tan coalition in the Republican Party. It is the beginning of the rise of a more militant civil rights group. The country is never the same after this, and in this one year you can actually see the seeds of virtually everything that we now associate with our contemporary political system. Happens that one year. Of course, famously, it is the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which is a landmark piece of legislation, the first major civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. But it's also the passage of the beginning of the war on poverty. So many of the social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, that are an essential part of American society now, albeit hotly debated. All of that began in this one 12-month period. On top of which, of course, is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the beginning of Vietnam. One of the things that I find so fascinating about President Johnson, and everyone who knew him talks about him in this way, is his size, his ambition, his reach, his appetite. It seems as though everything about him was outsized, was Texan. And as I spent more time reading and researching and talking to people about President Johnson, my own feelings have evolved. In many ways, particularly if you just look at his domestic program, he is unquestionably one of the greatest progressive presidents we've ever had in the country, and you could easily, maybe one of the top presidents, period. But then, of course, there's Vietnam and the tragedy of Vietnam. I think what is particularly poignant about LBJ and tragic about his story is that he could see, actually, what was happening in Vietnam, but couldn't find, from his own political standpoint, a way out. And he knew it would be the destruction of his domestic program, which was all he really cared about, and yet he couldn't find a way out. So he did wonderful things for this country, and he did terrible things for this country, and his legacy is very, very mixed. And the fact that he was conscious of it, that he could see it coming, but couldn't figure out a way to solve this, is, I think, very tragic, actually. And I have wound up, without excusing any of the things that he did, feeling a great deal of sympathy for President Johnson. Johnson, particularly as a legislator, was brilliant. He was notorious for what came to be known as the Texas twist, which was his way of intimidating, cajoling, bullying, enticing, seducing, amusing, bludgeoning people into doing what he wanted them to do. He took full advantage of his size. He was a very big man. He was tall, and he was solidly built. And he would get right up in people's faces, and he would grab their lapels, and he'd put his finger through the buttonhole, and he would pull them in, and he would talk to them, and he would just literally hang on to them until he had finished saying what he needed to say. And he was very effective. He was very effective. But It's not just that he was physically intimidating. He was charming. He was a wonderful raconteur with a terrific sense of humor. Part of what is interesting is that the popular perception of LBJ is based entirely on these admittedly rather boring speeches that he delivered in a really kind of solemn and laborious manner, what he thought was a presidential manner. It was a deliberate and conscious attempt on his part to acquire a certain gravitas, whereas in private he was apparently the most entertaining, the most charming, the funniest person you could ever spend an evening with. Just would have people in stitches, always a story, an anecdote at his fingertips, either some juicy political tidbit or some very, very funny, somewhat scandalous, scatological story from the backwoods, Texas, where he came from. It was fascinating contradiction. It's very important to understand the task I've set myself here and what we're doing. This is not a docudrama. This is not what might be referred to as a living newspaper piece. While I have been very faithful to the facts, and in some cases actually incorporated speeches or dialogue, thanks to J. Edgar Hoover, we have a lot of this has been secretly tape recorded, so we actually know what people said and when they said it and how they said it. But not all that withstanding, even though I am very aware of the historical facts, as a dramatist, I'm interested in a certain part of this story here. And I'm only going to talk about that part of the story in this play. And what I am interested in is the ascension to power here by Lyndon Baines Johnson. I'm interested in how he managed it, and I'm interested in what the costs of that were. So the drama here is quite Shakespearean in its intention and scope. Shakespeare was, of course, fascinated with kings and the whole notion of how you achieve the crown and how you maintain the crown and what is the proper relationship between the ruler and the ruled. And he had a lot to say about the moral ambiguities of power and politics. And that's what we're about here in All the Way.